friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the chapter conundrum. And in today's video, we're going to do my July wrap up. So we're going to talk about all the books I read in the month of July. So in the month of July, I read 20 books, plus I also DNF'd one. And I was participating in Battle of the Bands for movie soundtracks. So because I was doing a readathon, a lot of the books I picked to read this month are shorter or things that I could breeze through. Also, I had been reading a lot of fantasy prior, and I kind of veered away from that this month just so I would have quicker, easier things to get through and knew that I wouldn't slump. So part of my strategy in a readathon is always to switch up genres that I'm reading, because I find if I read the same genre over again a lot, I will slump. So you'll see that reflected in the stats coming up here. So I read 5,908 pages, so I was very strategic about picking shorter books to fit into those 20 prompts that I did. I had an average rating of 3.95 stars, which I think is fairly high for me. So my most read genre this month was actually sci-fi, which was great because it had been a while since I had read some sci-fi. And I will put the breakdown here of all the genres I read, but basically I dabbled all over the place. I read a little here, a little there. And without further ado, let's hop into what I read and how I felt about it. So the first book I read is Falling by TJ Newman. And this is a thriller that basically starts out with a pilot about to do a flight, and he gets a phone call saying that his family's been kidnapped and he either needs to crash the plane killing everyone on board or his family will die. And he's told that there are some backup hijackers on board this plane, and it's basically the story of how everything unfolds from there. So I gave this a 4.25 star rating, and I really enjoyed the pacing in this book and the tension layered throughout as well. It opened with a bang, and it definitely didn't let up from there. I liked that we also got snippets of a past timeline where we found out more background information about him and his family, but I definitely thought the author took some creative liberties in terms of airline pilot and FBI protocols, and I would have liked to see a little bit more in terms of what was happening with air traffic control during all of this. And so for that reason, it wasn't a perfect read for me, but I still really enjoyed it and would recommend it if you're interested. Next up, I did a reread of one of the books I loved when I was younger, and that would be The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And definitely my reread did not disappoint. I gave it a 5-star rating again. Mainly, I enjoyed that it was very easy to get drawn into the story again because I had forgotten so much about it. But also the character work in here is excellent. So I thought the characters themselves were definitely well thought out. Their personalities were fleshed out. But I also really appreciated the dynamics that they had with each other and the reactions that they had to things going on within the story. I thought that the thought processes they had felt genuine and true to something that character would think. And I also really appreciated that the stakes throughout the story felt real and that the author took some risks with the ending, and I think it worked phenomenally well. So next up, I read a YA contemporary, Curveball, The Year I Lost My Grip by Jordan Sonnenblick, and this follows a young teenager, Peter, I think, yeah, Peter, who basically is a baseball player. It's what he wants to do. He had aspirations of, college baseball, but he finds out at the beginning of this book that he has an injury in his elbow, I think it is, and basically that his baseball days are over. So I thought that this was going to be a lot of him like soul searching, trying to discover his niche and his new interests, and sort of him figuring out where his life was leading now, and that he was going to have to struggle and really do a lot of like self-discovery or like introspection to try and sort that out. But I don't necessarily feel like I got everything I wanted in terms of that. I sort of felt like his new identity kind of fell into his lap very easily and very quickly, and it had a different dynamic in the story than what I was hoping. I was kind of hoping for more of like serious, heartfelt, really introspective content in here, and while we got some of that, we definitely got a lot more of like typical teenage stuff, which I thought was well done, but it just wasn't really what I was expecting or looking for in this. I still really enjoyed it. I definitely think Sonnenblick is worth checking out if you haven't read his stuff already and you read YA or middle grade. All in all, I still had a good time with this, and I gave it 4 stars. So next up, Nala and I buddy read all 3 of the Hunger Games books. So Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay. And I loved these books the first time I read them. I loved them again on reread, and I definitely gave them all 5 stars, just mostly for the nostalgia and the experience of reading them again. They were so easy to sink into, and these rereads were perfectly timed for after I had my wisdom teeth removed and was on pain meds. And it was really fun to talk to Nala about everything as I was reading. There were definitely some details in the story that I had forgotten about because it had been so long since I read them, and not every detail was in the adaptation. I do think the intensity of the plot and the pacing were slightly diminished on reread because I did know where things were leading, but I still had a really good time, and I definitely caught on to a lot more foreshadowing, especially in Catching Fire for sure. So I enjoyed the experience of that reread especially, and I'm really glad that I refreshed myself on the series before Sunrise on the Reaping comes out next year. And if you don't know, this is going to be a new Hunger Games novel that follows the second quarter quell, so Haymitch's Games, and I'm excited to check that out when it drops. So next up, I buddy read Credence by Penelope Douglas with Layla, who is Nico from Nico's Book Review's wife. And I had a good time buddy reading this with her. I didn't necessarily love all the aspects of this book though, and I ended up giving it a 3-star. So part of it was that it was my first foray into dark romance, and I guess I didn't really realize how much I would have to suspend my disbelief in this particular story in order to find it believable. Our main character, Tiernan, in this is fantastic. She definitely tells it like it is, and she's just fun to follow. But definitely, if it's the kind of situation where I'm putting myself in her shoes, I definitely would not make some of the choices that she made. I definitely don't always understand her character motivations and the reasoning behind what she decides. But overall, it was still an interesting ride. And I'm glad that I had this buddy read experience with Layla. It was really fun to talk to her about it as we read. So next up, I read Virgins, which is an Outlander prequel, and it's by Diana Gabaldon. And this follows Jamie before the events of Outlander. And I thought going into this that I was going to get maybe some new revelations about Jamie's backstory or some like interesting tidbits that I hadn't gotten from the main series. But that wasn't really the case. I didn't really find anything in here to get excited about digging up. And I still had a good time with it, but it just wasn't the same series without Claire or without Jamie's more mature personality. I guess I appreciate him more as an adult than I do as such a younger person. So I gave this one a 3-star as well. I would recommend it to diehard fans of the series, but I would also say that you're probably not missing out on anything if you decide to skip it. So next up, I read Zen and the Art of Faking It, also by Jordan Sonnenblick. And this is the story of San, who moves to a new town with his mom. And he's a teenager who is going to a new school. And he decides that he's going to kind of put on a bit of a front and give himself a bit of a different image than he's typically had in the past. And this leads to him being a little bit more popular among his peers, but it also puts him in some interesting situations because he is faking stuff. And he, of course, has to dodge being caught in his deception. So I gave this a 3-star rating. It's definitely my least favorite Sonnenblick to date. And the main reason that this one didn't work as well for me as his other books is that I felt like his main characters in here, San, and I forget the female main character's name. Anyway, I felt like neither of them were very reactive, or I didn't really get a lot of like interesting thought processes that they had. And I also felt that the story was kind of very insular. Like they were around a lot of different people, but we didn't really get to see much about the other people or learn much about them or really interact with them a ton. And so those two things kind of coupled together made it not work as well for me. I would say if you're interested in picking up Sonnenblick, I would recommend either Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie or Notes from the Midnight Driver over this one. But I still am glad I read it. So next up, I picked up In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park, and this is a nonfiction memoir about a young lady who escapes or defects from North Korea. And I loved reading this. I gave it a 5-star rating. And I think mainly I connected to the writing in this, so I really enjoyed reading about her experiences. I definitely learned things about life in North Korea and what escape could look like. I appreciated that she included some photos of her family in here as well. So like just a quick glimpse, there's some pictures of them. But the main reason I had a great experience reading this is because even though she went through some pretty harrowing things, she didn't really shy away from explaining how she was feeling or how she was reacting to things in those experiences. So it definitely did not feel like a dry memoir. I will say too, I've seen some like videos on YouTube saying that like she's a liar and kind of comparing different aspects of her story from different pieces of like interviews she's done or like tidbits from various places. And I did watch one of those, and I basically found out that it was very obvious that the creator of the one that I watched, at least, had not read her book, because there were definitely explanations for everything he talked about within the book. So I haven't really dug too deep into whether the accusations of her lying are a thing, but from what I saw anyways, it can all be explained by reading her book, and I would recommend it. So next up, I picked up Happy Place by Emily Henry, and this follows a group of college friends who are sort of reuniting for a fun weekend in one of their traditions. They're visiting one of the girls' family's cottage in Maine. The only problem is 2 of them were in a long-term relationship. They were engaged and they broke up, but they didn't tell the rest of the friends. And so when they get there, they're sort of forced into confronting that, but then as they're about to say like, hey, this happened, other things come into play and they change their mind on that, and they end up faking it for the sake of their friends, essentially, and things ensue from there. So this was definitely my least favorite Emily Henry so far. I've also read People We Meet on Vacation and Beach Read, and I enjoyed both of those much more. This one was a 2.75 star read for me, unfortunately. So a huge part of the reason that this didn't really work for me is that the main characters seemed to basically only be together because they were physically attracted to each other. It was very frustrating to see that like they didn't really have any other sort of connections going for them, especially since they had such an established long-term relationship before the events of this book, and because we're seeing multiple timelines. So we're seeing them present day, and then we're also seeing things that happened in the past. So you think you've been with someone for like 10 years, you should have established connections. Like, I don't think physical attractiveness is enough to hold your relationship together. And the main character was sort of unapologetic about the fact that she basically was mainly interested in him for his attractiveness. Like, one of the quotes in the book on page 152 of the paperback was, "It's always a complete mystery to me," he murmurs, "what you're thinking." And she says, "I'll help you out," I say. "80% of it is picturing you naked." And it's like, okay. At one point, this couple even goes long distance, and it's not, yeah. Like, as somebody who's been in a long distance relationship, like, you gotta have more going for you than physical attractiveness to make a relationship work and last for 10 years. Sorry, but you do. I also thought that the issues and conflicts that these two had are realistic things for a lot of couples to encounter, but they absolutely did not feel realistic for this couple to encounter. Like, the type of stuff they're figuring out is sort of the kind of thing you figure out within like the first 2 years of being with someone. And these two have been together for 10 years. So that logic for me just didn't cut it. They also don't seem to have enough baggage with each other for having been together that long. Like, basically, on the whole, just this setup of them already having an established relationship coupled with who they are as characters and the things we find out through the book, it just didn't work for me logically. I also felt that even though you could benefit from seeing and reading their experience, I wish that the conflicts Emily Henry did explore within this book were delved into with more depth, because I thought that at least could have been more of a redeeming quality for it. But no, I mean, it wasn't a terrible read. It's just mainly the logic of things that didn't work for me on this one. And yeah, definitely my least favorite Emily Henry so far. So next up, I picked up Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood, hoping to have a better contemporary romance experience. And this one I enjoyed. I gave 4 stars. So this follows our main character, Elsie, who is an adjunct physics professor. And to make ends meet, she also has a side gig of sort of like fake dating people. So she's like fake dating this one guy, and then she turns up to a job interview, and it turns out that one of his family members, I think it's his brother, is one of the interviewers. And so she's kind of told his family that she's like a children's librarian. So she's turning up to this interview for a physics professor position, and she's got some explaining to do. So I did feel like this one in particular opened with a lot more humor than Ellie Hazelwood typically has in her books, and I appreciated that aspect of it. I definitely felt like it was very refreshing that our love interest and main character were very straightforward with each other. They definitely didn't have communication issues. You know, they were very upfront with each other even when they felt it was risky, which was kind of like a breath of fresh air, because quite often in romance novels you don't see that. Miscommunication is often used as a writing device, and it wasn't here. So I liked that aspect of this quite a bit. The main reason that this wasn't a new fave for me was because I felt like the book was really centered around a theme or a message that the author was trying to get out. And essentially, the story didn't feel natural or organic. It didn't feel like it unfolded in a way that really made sense. It kind of felt like every scene we were put into was very purposeful for this point that the author was trying to make. And so it felt kind of heavy-handed. That said, I still had a really good time reading it and would recommend it, and gave it 4 stars. So next up, I picked up The Secret Sheriff of 6th Grade by Jordan Sonnenblick, and this is a contemporary middle grade that follows Maverick as he's going into 6th grade. And he has a lot of tough home life situations. The opening pages of this book deal with him coming home to his mom and her boyfriend at the time having some big fight, and it turns out he's abusive. So definitely there's a lot of like real life situations that are kind of heavy that this character is dealing with, which is something I really appreciate in Jordan Sonnenblick's books. And he definitely does a fantastic job of keeping this at a middle grade level and also balancing out those tough situations with humor and just mainly focusing on other things in this character's life, like his school situation and his friendship dynamic with side characters and all that. But definitely I like that he doesn't shy away from putting his younger characters in real tough situations. And I appreciate that he is willing to put younger characters into tough situations and explore that and give insight into how that could be experienced for someone younger. I also think that this would be excellent for younger readers in terms of having empathy for their peers or classmates who may have tough situations that they're going through at home. I definitely appreciated this story, but I do wish that it was more aged up into YA so we could have explored some of the tougher things in a little bit more detail and depth. But that said, I still had a really good time with it and gave it 4 stars. Next up, I picked up Fool Me Twice at Christmas by Camilla Isley, and this is a contemporary romance set over Christmas time. And I gave this a 3.5 star rating. I did enjoy it, but I also felt like it was very much in the vein for people who love Hallmark movies because it definitely had that sort of a vibe to it. And that's not really my thing. I usually find those ones a little bit more cheesy than I want, and I prefer when my stories are a little bit more realistic. But that said, this was an enjoyable time, and I did like the story of how things unfolded. I do wish that we explored the characters' motivations with a little bit more depth, and I also thought that the ending and resolution could have been a lot better. I felt like some of the decisions that the main characters made in this one really had some lasting impact or effects for the side characters, and it was just never really resolved or addressed with those side characters, so seeing some of that on page would have been great. But I definitely understand the choice to keep this a bit more light and fluffy and like the perfect thing when you're in the mood for just a happy, easy read. So definitely to anyone who loves Hallmark movies and romance, I would recommend you give this one a go. But if you feel like me, then it's not really essential. So after that, I picked up The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, and this is a short story horror collection. And I picked this up on Jake's recommendation for one of the prompts, and he wasn't really sure how I would feel about it. But I think he forgot that pretty much every story in here has elements of magical realism, which if you know me, you know that's not my jam. I prefer my stories to have a lot more logic and explanation than magical realism provides. That said, I did enjoy some aspects of this, but I definitely had that same underlying like, oh, I wish this was explained more with all of the stories. That said, I thought the author was very creative in what she came up with. And I would recommend it to people who want to read horror where the author really branches out and takes some risks and introduces some new interesting things that you haven't seen done before. Obviously, the magical realism elements definitely set back my rating a fair amount, so I ended up giving this a 3-star. Next up, I picked up Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and I was going to read this for the Ray Bradbury book club that my husband Jake does over on our Discord, the Bookish Drummer Discord. But I actually DNF'd this 12 pages in, guys. I could not with the amount of description that was in here. Basically, I could sum up anything useful that I learned in about 2 sentences from the first 12 pages, and the rest was basically all descriptions. And again, if you know my reading taste or if you know me, I don't visualize while I read. And so books that are very description heavy, I will be zoning out and having a lot of difficulty trying to pay attention, especially when the descriptions are just like for the character surroundings or setting the stage. It's hard for me. Like, if you're describing a character's emotions, great. But if you're describing things that are like visual to the story, no. I just couldn't stick with this one, guys. I couldn't do it. The frustrating part is I would probably enjoy the story in here based on the premise and what it's about, but I just cannot wade through the amount of descriptions in this one to get there. Next, I revisited a childhood favorite, Ramona the Pest, and this is the second book in the Beezus and Ramona series by Beverly Cleary. And I found it very interesting to go back to this one. So this is one that my sister used to read to me at bedtime when I was very young, like maybe 4-ish. And I definitely would bug her to read the same chapter over and over and over again. It's like the Halloween chapter in here. But anyway, I hadn't read it since I was a child, so I thought it would be really fun to go back and revisit. And I still had a good time reading it and actually picking up on a lot of the details in the story that I definitely didn't pick up on as a younger child. But I don't know that I would really recommend people pick it up anymore. It's definitely a product of its time. Like, it came out, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. And there are a lot of things in here that are just very outdated or very, like, of its time. Like, there's things in here that if a child today was experiencing that, like, Children's Protective Services would be called. Or, like, there's things about typical gender roles. All those sorts of things that are just very different today. That said, I definitely had a fun time coming back to this one and picking up on a lot more of the subtext of the story, and I give it 4 stars. Next up, I picked up one of my most anticipated reads for the year, Middle of the Night by Riley Sager. And if you don't know, Riley Sager is one of my all-time favorite authors, definitely my favorite thriller author. I have consistently enjoyed every book he's written, and I've rated them all at least a 4-star. So, did this one hold up? I did give this a 4-star rating and thought it was solid. I definitely enjoyed my time reading it. Definitely always enjoy his writing. There's something about his writing that just captivates me in a way that many authors can't do. One thing I wish was that I hadn't done the audiobook for this one, and mainly because the guy who narrates this is the same guy who narrates the You books by Caroline Kepnes. And so in my head, I'm thinking of Joe from the You series as I'm reading this. And so I have like headcanon going on for this book, or like predictions going on for this book based on some of the things that I know about Joe. And that definitely affected the way that I read this. I think I might have enjoyed it more if I had skipped the audio and just read it with my eyes. That said, this was one of his more slow burn type stories. A lot of his other ones have better pacing or faster pacing. They have more things that you're intrigued about as you're reading, or more things kind of interspersed into the story that could be like potential red herrings, I feel. So there wasn't a whole ton that I was wondering about as I was reading this, other than the main mystery of the story, of course. I also will say that usually Riley Sager is very considerate of logic in his thrillers. He definitely takes time to make sure that plot events are plausible, but this one, the ending kind of had some logical issues for me. There were definitely like holes I could point in the story that say like, oh, that doesn't really make sense because of this, or like, if this happened, then why didn't this occur? That kind of sort of thing. I'm obviously not going to spoil anything. But I had a really good time reading this. I didn't fully buy into the ending, and I wish that I hadn't had Joe in my mind while I was reading. But I definitely still enjoyed this, and I definitely found it better than a lot of the thrillers I pick up. And if you don't typically have those same issues with thrillers and you enjoy more of like a slow burn pacing to get to an explosive ending, then I would still recommend it. I would just say there are better Riley Sagers you could pick up. Next up, I continued on the Jordan Sonnenblick train and picked up Dodger and Me, the first book in his Dodger and Me series. And I enjoyed this one. I gave it a 4-star rating. That said, I do think this one is much younger on the spectrum of his books. This is kind of like lower, younger, middle grade. And it follows our main character, Willie, who one day walking home encounters a magical blue chimp named Dodger, and no one else can really see Dodger, so he's kind of, I guess, treated as Willie's imaginary friend. But there's a lot of humor in here. There's a lot of valuable life lessons in here. It's very endearing and a fun, easy read, but it's definitely something I've long aged past, and I don't necessarily feel like there was a lot of content in here for adults. That said, I'm glad I picked it up and gave it a try, and definitely enjoyed the humorous, lighthearted side of this one. After that, I picked up Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this was another reread for me, and this is a favorite novella of mine. And I'm not really going to go into what this one is about because it's better to go into it really not knowing much. All I'm going to tell you is that our story starts with our main character, and his family's landlord is coming to town, and things are not great, and obviously there are ogres involved. That's really all you need to know going in, because the joy of this story is unpacking what's happening and discovering another layer to what's happening as you keep reading. And mainly I wanted to pick this up on a reread because a lot of people in the Discord were reading it for the first time, and I couldn't remember a lot of details about the story, and I wanted to jump in on the discussion, so I thought it would be a great time to pick it up and reread it. I was definitely sucked right back into the story, just like I was the first time, especially because I hadn't remembered everything, and I gave it 4.5 stars and would recommend it. Then the last book I picked up in July was Expert System's Brother, also an Adrian Tchaikovsky novella. And mainly after Ogres, I was like, okay, I enjoyed this so much. I got to check out more of his novellas and see what I can find. But this one didn't work as well for me. I gave it a 3-star rating. This one definitely had some very cool, unique ideas and concepts involved, but the writing sort of felt clinical in here. Like, it was very emotionally detached in the narration. There was also just a lot of telling us things instead of showing us things, and I didn't love the narrator. So overall, while I still thought that this was cool and worth checking out, it didn't work as well for me as a lot of his other work has, and that led to my 3-star rating. So that was all the books I read in the month of July. It's surprising that I really didn't have all that much fantasy on here, but definitely in August I get back to fantasy. I've already read several adult fantasies in August, and it's felt good to get back to that. But anyways, let me know what your favorite book from the month of July was. And let me know if you had similar or very different experiences to me with any of these books, if I've convinced you to pick any of them up and give them a try based on what I had to say about them, if I've steered you away from picking any of them up based on what I had to say. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye.